Okay, so let's start. There's a homework due today for those of you who are taking the classroom version. Also, I had mentioned that the lab is going to be coming out soon, so I will make sure it gets posted this week. Okay. Mentioned number of times labs can be done individually or in groups. If you need a lab partner and haven't found one, we had recommended that you go to Piazza and post. So far, a total of 2 people have posted requests. So I don't know if most of you are already teamed up or haven't bothered. Okay. If it's the latter, you need to do this ASAP. Okay. Anybody still looking for lab partners? Everyone is teamed up here already? Okay, good. If you need to still look for someone, please look at Piazza. There are some people looking around. Or if you can't find someone, post them. Okay, there's an entire other section that is taking the class online, and there are students there also looking for lab partners and such. Okay. Okay, so there was a slide remaining last time. I'm going to go through that, and then we'll talk today about communication and distributed systems. So remember, we were talking about server architectures. We said that you can have servers that are designed that are clustered, it could be replicated and so on. Okay, but more fundamentally, when you design your server, whether it's distributed, replicated or not, you have to decide what architecture you're going to pick. I alluded to this in the very first class, and I said we'll come back to it and have a short discussion. So let's do that before I move on to communication. So I mentioned at that time that you can either design your server as a sequential process where your server process waits for requests to come over a network, and it's single threaded. So it is going to take one request at a time, process it, send back a response. If additional requests come in when a request is being processed, those requests are queued up and have to wait. Okay? Pure sequential process. Okay? And at the other end of the spectrum, you have concurrent processes which are multi-threaded. So when we talked about threading, I had mentioned this as well. Okay? So what happens in that case is your server process has multiple threads. Threads could be dynamically spawned as each request comes in, or threads could be pre-spawned. Okay? When you have a pool of worker threads, it doesn't matter which one. As soon as a request comes in, if you have a thread that is available, either needs to be spawned or is already idle, you can essentially assign that request to that thread. Okay. So those are the two ends of the spectrum. Okay. There are two other architectures that I had briefly alluded to. Okay. One derives directly from concurrent architectures. Okay. So rather than making it multi-threaded, you could have multiple processes. Okay. So you can have, as a request comes in, you can either spawn a new process, or more likely there is already a pool of processes, you hand that request to that process rather than handing it to a thread. So you have more than one process. They are all worker processes. Requests come in. There is a listener process. It just hands it over. The process goes off and handles that processing of that request. Okay. So you have multi-process architectures, which are analogous to multi-thread. You're making use of processes rather than threads for concurrency. Okay. And what is in the middle is event-based. Event-based architectures are designed when either you don't want threading or processes, or you just don't have support for it in your system, or you want it done differently for a variety of reasons. So what happens here is you again have a single process, okay? Single threaded, single process that is going to be event driven. Okay? And so what happens is when requests come in, you generate an event, the process is going to go and handle that event, saying a new request has come in. Okay, maybe then handles, do a little bit of processing, and the request might end up doing I/O to read a file or some such thing. And then while it does that, the process is asynchronous. It's not going to do blocking calls. It's not going to wait for the file to be written. It may go off and process something else. When the data comes back from disk, another event is generated. At that point, you come back from whatever you're doing, process that event and so on. So this is an asynchronous way of designing servers. Okay? They're interrupt or event driven. Okay? As something happens in the system, arrival of a process, a file read completes, or there's some sort of an interrupt, you essentially asynchronously go into an event handler or an interrupt handler, process that event, and then go back to doing what you want. Okay. So this is no longer sequential. Your code is not executing sequentially in a blocking way. Your control flow essentially goes from one event handling to another event handling. If you have written any GUI based applications, you will be familiar with what events are. Okay? Click of a button triggers an event, for instance. Okay? If you write a browser, if you have browser GUI, you basically click on a link, that's an event. Okay? Your process has to basically go into an event handler that says, what do I do for this click? Okay? And then maybe you click something else that generates another event, and then you have to go into another event handler and so on. So design of your entire system is event based. So you have to think of what events can occur, and for each event you have to write an event handler. Okay? And the code is going to go from one event to another. Typically, the thing to keep in mind is all of the I/O here is asynchronous. Okay? You don't do blocking calls, because if you block and an event comes in, there is not much you can do. So you want to use asynchronous operations as much as possible to maximize the servicing of multiple events, okay, in somewhat concurrent fashion. Okay. It's a single threaded process that you would write that would basically be designed to handle events that occur in your system. Okay. It could be arrival of a request, it could be I/O, any of these. Okay. So you have the whole spectrum from pure sequential, single process, sequential. Okay, here in the sequential mode, you have to remember these are all blocking calls. So each request comes in to service that request. If you have to do I/O, you will block. Okay, so it's going to take a while. And while it's blocked, the server cannot do anything else. It has to wait for that I/O to finish. Okay. So this is synchronous communication. Okay. You can also do, as I said, in event-based architecture, you use events and asynchronous communication. You have concurrent, there are two architectures, thread-based and process. Okay, so you have the whole spectrum. So let's have a quick discussion on efficiency consideration. Okay, what architectures or what kinds of efficiency. Okay, so if you just had to lay them out on a scale from the most efficient to the least efficient, how would you list them? And why? Yes.
I don't know about the most efficient, but I feel like the least efficient might be the pure sequential server.
Okay. So suggestion or comment is least efficient is pure sequential, right? Okay, so you want to say why you think that?
Just because it's going to have issues with blocking, or if there's one really large event or large task that it has to do, that'll queue up everything behind it. It won't be able to manage multiple concurrent processes.
So suggest or the comment is that basically each request blocks processing of a request, blocks all other requests that come in, so they all have to wait, and hence it's least efficient. Okay, so that's absolutely true, but implicit here is when I say which one is most efficient, you should say based on what metric. The efficiency is not like a single term. So you could have efficiency based on throughput. Okay, throughput is the number of requests you can service per unit time. Okay, that if you use that metric, then what has been suggested is absolutely true. So pure sequential is typically going to have the least throughput because there is no concurrency at all. Okay, you are essentially purely servicing one request at a time. All other requests have to wait. So all of these other architectures actually have some concurrency built in. Okay? This one does not. So based on throughput considerations, pure sequential is the least efficient. Okay, that's good. Anything else? I mean, there are three more we have to find ordering.
I can think of thread-based as more efficient than process-based. First, because you have less overhead to create and destroy threads in processes.
Okay, so thread-based is more efficient than process-based because thread-based has less overhead in creating threads than processes. Okay? When I talked about threading, that was several lectures ago, I said that creation and deletion of threads is more efficient than creation and deletion of processes. Okay? Switching between threads is more efficient than switching between processes. Okay? So So what was mentioned here is absolutely true. Thread creation, deletion, more efficient. But you could have pre-spawned pools, okay, to get over that. So if I had a set of processes and a set of threads that are pre-spawned, then thread creation, deletion is no longer in the picture. Okay, then you can ask which one is more efficient. In that case, thread-based still wins because switching between threads is more efficient than switching. Context switches here are more efficient than switching between processes. Yes, comment.
Thread-based things have fault sharing problems.
Call what?
Fault sharing problems.
So question is, do thread-based architectures have call sharing? Can you elaborate what you mean by call sharing? Yeah, fault sharing. What aspect of fault sharing? Okay. Why would that not be true for process-based?
Process-based, you have different memories for different processes. So that will be a problem.
Okay. So point being asked is, what about fault sharing, okay, that occurs when you have caches and so on. Okay. You may have, so you have to realize this is all order of magnitude. How expensive is it to switch between a process versus what might be the potential impact of some cache items being shared, but they are not really shared. Okay. Typically, if you look at the overheads of creating a process, deleting a process, or switching between processes, context switches, those tend to be millisecond operations or more, hundreds of millisecond operations. Any impact that caches might have, whether due to fault sharing or just misses because threads were scheduled on different processor, you start with a cold cache, those tend to be microsecond impacts. Because instructions operate on nanosecond or microsecond time scale, so caches also operate at that time scale. So there is a big difference between the impact of actually a context switch causing some trouble versus a cache line being falsely shared. Okay. All right. So any other points here? Thread-based versus process-based.
Event-based could be the most performant by way of server resources if it's designed to be non-blocking.
Okay. So event-based.
So you're using resources only as and when you require processing power. But if you're doing I/O, then you're not blocking the server.
Okay. So I will let me repeat what has been just said. Okay, so this comment about event-based, but just so that we understand what we have done for the rest, we said pure sequential is the least efficient. Okay. Between these two, process-based and thread-based, we said thread-based is more efficient than process-based. So we have ordered them as pure sequential, process-based, and thread-based in increasing order of efficiency. Okay. And the only one that's left is event-based, and where does that fall? And the comment that was just made is event-based could be actually the most efficient of the four. And by virtue of having non-blocking calls, and not having to wait on any I/O, this will make it more efficient. Do people have anything for or against or any other comments?
Maybe it will depend on the number of cores or something you have, because if it's event-based, you'll probably have a thread that is just running on one core.
Okay, very good point. Yes.
So, I mean, you will still have just one queue and one thread running on one core, picking up events from the queue and dispatching them. Whereas in a thread-based or a process-based, you can have multiple processes running simultaneously on multiple cores.
Okay, that's a good point. So point is that event-based will not get efficiency gains if you have more than one core in the system. Okay, because event-based is single-threaded, single-process architecture. You put more cores, you cannot take any benefit out of it. Okay? So those are the two considerations of what has been mentioned. Is first you have to say you cannot actually order event-based versus thread-based and process-based unless you tell me whether you have one core or many cores. Okay? In a single core system, okay, it is indeed true that event-based architectures are the most efficient. Okay? And the reason for this is everything is being handled, concurrency is being simulated really using event handlers. Okay, you jump from one event to another and you get concurrency. For non-blocking calls, you're basically just going from one event to another. I/O doesn't impact you at all. Okay? There is no context switches at all. Okay? So in thread-based, at least when you jump from the servicing of one request to another, you have to context switch threads, okay, or processes. Here, this is just a function call within a process. So you go from one event handler to another event handler. Event handler for request 1 to event handler for request 2. Okay, that's control within a process. There is no call, no context switches at all there. Okay. So by virtue of not having any context switches even across threads, you will have the most efficiency to be seen in event-based architecture as compared to thread-based and process. Right? So if you have single core, event-based architectures will give you the maximum throughput. Right? But as soon as you go to multi-core systems, those gains go away. Right? Simply because event-based is inherently a single threaded process, a traditional process. It cannot make use of other processors or other cores on the system. Both thread-based and process-based will win because they will get real parallelism. You will be able to run multiple threads or multiple processes on multiple cores. Okay? So if you have multiple cores, you will basically get these two will dominate these two because these two are single-threaded processes. Okay? Thread-based and process-based will win. Yeah, and between the two, thread-based will be better than process-based because it has lower context switches. Okay? For a single core, event-based will be better. Okay? If you want to design the most efficient process servers, you typically do event-based architecture. Okay? And you can take advantage of multiple cores as well. You just have to have more than one thread. Okay? And each thread does event-based handling. Okay? So each thread runs on a separate core, and then it handles some events, and the other thread handles other events. Okay? That architecture I did not mention multi-threaded and event-based, but that also exists. Okay. Now, when you design your lab, you have a choice of which one to pick. Okay. Partly it will depend on the language. Okay. Event-based, although they're most efficient, are also the most complex to code because everything has to be written as a set of events. Debugging event handlers are not very easy because you're jumping from one place to another. Typically, you will not get repeatability in your code. So if there's a bug, debugging, is harder and so on and so forth. But if you write the code, well, you will get efficiency. Okay? Thread-based is the easiest of the lot to write. Okay? When you want concurrency, of course, sequential is the most trivial of the lot. Okay? But if you want concurrency, thread-based tends to be better. Process-based is somewhere in between. So you will need to have additional mechanisms to send data between processes. In thread-based, everything is shared address space. So not much to do. Okay. Any other comments here before we move on? Alright, so let's move on to communication in distributed systems. Yeah, so we'll do a quick overview of what this topic is, then we're going to spend some time today on remote procedure calls. Next time I'm going to talk about RMIs and distributed objects and stream-oriented communication. Okay, so again, we have a little bit of review material, very basic stuff from undergrad networking. I'm going to go through that quickly, just so that for those of you who may not have enough background, you will be up to speed. Then we'll jump into RPCs. Okay. So first of all, you need to understand why we are talking about communication at all. Okay. So I said in a distributed system, you have more than one component in your system that is communicating over a network. Yes, these components talk to one another, communicate to one another. Yes, so communication between components is inherent in any distributed system or application. And the question is, what abstraction should the system provide to enable this communication? Yeah, so if you look at it at a very high level, you will see that communication can be structured or unstructured in distributed system. Unstructured communication is essentially sharing memory or sharing data structures. Okay? Now in the distributed world, there is something called distributed shared memory. Okay? What that allows you to do is it allows one process on one machine to share parts of its memory with another process on another machine. So you can essentially think of it as network pointers. You can actually dereference a pointer where the pointer actually points to a memory address of another process on a different machine and you get access to it. Okay. Typically when you have a pointer in C or C++, that's referring to a memory address in the context of that process. You cannot typically go and look up some other process's address, let alone another process on another machine. Okay. But when people designed distributed systems long time ago, they came up with this notion of sharing memory across processes, just as you would share memory within a process. This allows you to do data communication. You can write to a pointer, you can read from a pointer on another machine. It's implicit message passing. So you are essentially communicating through memory. Okay. Or you can have similar data structures that are shared across machines. Okay. That's one way to enable communication. The system essentially has to provide you a mechanism by which you can access memory that belongs to another process. Okay. So now, as it turns out, although this was a very popular area of research in the 80s and 90s, there are hundreds and hundreds of papers written on this topic. This never really took off in any commercial system. You don't find distributed shared memory really in most systems. Okay? The closest thing you will find is some way in distributed objects by which you can actually dereference handles that belong to another object on another machine. That's the closest analogy we will find. And when we talk about RMIs next time and distributed objects, we will come back to this point. Okay? But as a general system, saying here is a distributed shared memory system, I can write any application on it, then I can access memory belonging to other processes. That has never really taken off. Okay? So as a result, I will not talk much about distributed shared memory because it's an interesting concept, but hasn't been used very much in real applications or real systems. Okay? But you should be aware that these things exist. Okay? The old version of the textbook actually had a chapter on it. Yeah, as you can see, because nobody uses it, that chapter is gone. Yeah, and the papers that have been written have also been forgotten, although there are hundreds of them, as I said. Yeah? So we will not talk about this much. We will come back to it briefly when we do distributed object and look at it in a very specific way, not look at general systems to do distributed shared memory. So this form of communication, not quite used. It's used in multi-threaded application. If you have multiple threads, you actually share memory, but that's memory of the same process. You don't have to do anything special. Okay? So much of the communication between processes or within a distributed system tends to be structured. Okay, you use explicit message passing. You send a message over a network, you receive messages and so on. Okay, this can be used using socket communication. That's the lowest level of communication you can use. Okay, you can explicitly open a socket, network socket, send messages, receive messages and so on. Or you could have higher level forms of communication such as remote procedure calls and remote methods and so on. Okay? So let's only look at this part of the picture. We'll ignore the unstructured part for the rest of this course essentially. Okay? Very quick slide on the network protocol stack. You should all be familiar with it, at least if you've taken any networking course. Okay, you have essentially a stack which basically represents different layers of the protocol processing. At the very top is the application layer. Okay? So these are two machines, okay? Machine A and machine B. Application on machine A wishes to communicate with application on machine B. Okay? So they have protocol by which they will communicate with one another. But any packets that A wishes to send to B basically has to traverse down the network protocol stack on that machine, actually go over a physical network. Okay? It may go through multiple hops, which is not shown here. It will arrive at the other machine, be processed in the reverse direction by the protocol stack, and then eventually handed to the application. Okay? This is how typically network communication works. Okay? There are different layers here. Okay, so if you know TCP/IP, okay, that is a protocol stack. In TCP/IP, many of these layers are not present. Essentially, you do have the physical layer, data link, network, transport layer. The session and presentation layers are missing, and then you have the application layer. Okay? Let's quickly look at what each of these stacks do, each layer in the stack does. Physical layer is essentially the lowest level of the stack. Okay? This is whether you use Ethernet or whether you use Wi-Fi or 3G cellular or your phone. All of those are physical layer, PHY layer. Okay? This is basically the medium for communication, essentially, that you use. Okay? Right on top of that is the data link layer. Okay? This is the layer that basically constructs the packet at the lowest layer and then puts it out on the medium. Okay? So this is where your Ethernet protocol will run, for instance. Okay? Or your 802.ABN, all of these Wi-Fi protocols will run. So this is where you basically construct the packet, add a header and send it out. Okay? So that's basically the data link layer. Okay? These are two very important layers in your protocol stack, the network layer and the transport layer. Okay? Network layer is essentially in the TCP/IP world, this maps to IP, and transport layer will map to TCP or UDP, these protocols. Okay? So another way to think about this, the network layer is responsible for hop by hop communication. The transport layer is responsible for end-to-end communication. Okay? Any packet that you send out from machine A might have to traverse multiple hops before it gets to its end destination. Okay? The network layer is essentially doing routing. Okay, it is deciding when a packet arrives at one hop, what is the next hop. Okay? And so the packet traverses hop by hop, okay, until it goes from the source to the destination. And the network layer is responsible for ensuring that it gets there, okay, one hop at a time. Okay? Transport layer is only running end to end. Basically, it runs at the source and it runs at the destination, and it does things like, is a packet missing? Okay, should I retransmit that packet? Okay, all of that is handled at the transport layer. Okay, it might have the notion of a session, for instance. You want to establish a communication endpoint. So the transport layer is end to end. It decides on when packets get lost, what to do with it, and so on and so on. And many other things like flow control, congestion control, all of that is handled at the transport layer. Okay? How fast to send? Should you back off if the network is congested? All of that decisions you make at the transport layer. In TCP will be doing all of this for you. Okay? And then you have the application layer at the very top. Okay? These two layers will ignore for now. Any questions on this? Like a 2-minute overview of TCP/IP. I presume most of you know this, or may not. If you don't, then this is all you need to know really. Okay? So this is the sort of a structure of what a network packet looks like. What is in here is the actual message that's called the payload that a source needs to send to a destination. As that message traverses down the protocol stack, each layer in the protocol stack will add a header to this packet. Okay, so if this is the message at the application layer, you could add a header. So HTTP is an application layer protocol, for instance. Okay, you may have HTTP header in the payload. Okay, so HTTP would add a header. Let's ignore these two, okay, the presentation and the session layer. So when it goes into the transport layer, TCP will add a header of its own, which may say where is what does it think of the packet, or it may do a checksum, or many other things might happen. Okay. Then the network layer, in this case IP will add a header which will say, here's the source address of the machine, here's the destination of the address of the machine, here's the port numbers, and so on and so forth. Okay, that's the network layer, okay, which is used at each hop to figure out where the packet came from, where does it need to go, so you will do routing and things like that. Okay. And when you come to the data link layer, there's another header that's added. So if you have Ethernet, you make an Ethernet frame, you add an Ethernet header to it. Okay? And then you may actually have another trailer here, which is the checksum, to make sure there are no errors in transmission and so on and so on. Okay? So the packet will basically get a sequence of headers, okay, as it goes down the protocol stack. And as it comes out at the other end, each layer is going to look at its header, decide what to do, strip that header and hand it about. Okay? So it's almost as if you want to send a message, you stick it in an envelope, you write some address on it. You give it to the next layer, that person sticks it in another envelope, they write their header on it and so on. At the other end, you sort of unwrap the message until you get the payload. Okay? So that's how protocol processing is going to work. Okay, so when you put the entire packet onto the physical medium, this whole thing is going to go up. There will be a payload and each layer would have added its own header. Okay, it may have a footer as well, some layers. Okay. Now, in the context of this class, we are going to come back and talk about middleware, okay, sometime later on in the class. Okay. Middleware protocols are essentially, from our perspective in the protocol stack picture, are going to sit between the transport layer and the application layer. So middleware is essentially a layer that sits between the OS and the application. Okay, that's what I mentioned several classes ago. From a protocol standpoint, middleware layers also will provide you numerous protocols. Okay, we will come back and we'll see what those protocols are or services are. Okay, but in the protocol stack context, it will essentially operate between the transport and application layer. So it could provide number of features like multicast or broadcast and group communication. All of that can be handled at the middleware layer. So that application can hand a packet to the middleware layer and say, send it to 10 destinations, multicasted or broadcasted. The middleware protocol will do that for you by constructing packets and so on. So essentially it sits between, from our perspective, it sits between TCP/IP and the application. Okay? So when we come to middleware, that's the picture we need to have from a networking standpoint, from a network protocol standpoint. Okay? So there's an example here of distributed commit, you can do distributed locks, the whole slew of protocols you can implement in the middleware. Okay, that's not one but many different protocols. Okay, so that's basically a very quick overview of protocols, and now let's talk a little bit about client server TCP. Okay, so just to understand what happens between a client and a server, let's say you have a simple client and a simple server, and the client is just sending a request to the server. Okay? And the communication is constructs a request, sends it to the server, server processes the request, sends back a response, communication is done. At a later point, you may send another request, but as far as this communication is concerned, from a client's perspective, there's one message going, which is the request, one reply message coming back. Okay? So these are sort of two packets that are exchanged. Now, if that communication actually occurs over TCP, what this figure shows you is essentially all the actual packets that go back and forth between the client and the server. Okay? So before the client can actually send a message to the server, the client has to establish a connection to the server, a TCP connection. Okay. This is basically showing you the TCP message exchange. There is what's called a three-way handshake between the client and the server to establish a TCP connection. Okay. And so this will basically, you don't have to really worry about what this is, just have a high-level understanding. Because the client sends what's called a SYN packet to the server. The SYN packet tells the server that I, the client, wish to establish a TCP connection with you. Okay. It's just a message to say, this is a handshake message. It goes to the server. Servers basically sends a SYN packet in the reverse direction and an acknowledgement to the first SYN packet. Because communication is duplex, two-way communication, you have to establish a connection in both directions. Okay. So the first SYN packet says that the client wishes to have a connection to the server. The server is going to send another SYN packet saying your server wishes to establish a connection with the client so that you have a duplex communication, and you send acknowledgement to the first SYN. Okay. And then essentially you can send an acknowledgement to the SYN of the server saying I received your message. Okay. Acknowledgement message simply says I received it. Okay. After these three messages are exchanged, you have established a TCP connection. Okay. This is what TCP is going to do. Applications don't do this. When you open a socket connection and say, I want to establish a TCP socket connection, these are the messages that are going to go back and forth. Right? After the first three messages, only then can you actually send that request you wanted to send to the server. Okay, that's the request message, that's message number 4. And then once the request is done, the client is done sending all of its data. So it's going to say, I am done. You send a fin. That's saying, I finished. Yes, now the request reaches the server is going to process it. Okay, but while it's processing, you will actually send acknowledgement saying, I received the request message, I received that fin. So that's just an acknowledgement. Okay. At some point, it will actually generate a reply and send the reply. Okay. And once the reply is done, the server is also done. Okay. So it's going to send a fin saying, I'm done sending data, and then you get an acknowledgement to that fin request. Okay. So, as you can imagine, a simple request message and a reply message has resulted in 9 packets going back and forth for a TCP connection. Okay, so this involves overhead of establishing a TCP connection, overhead of tearing down the TCP connection. These FIN messages are three-way handshake to tear down the connection. The SYN message exchange, the three-way handshake to set up a connection. Okay. So you see there's a lot of overhead here. Okay. So every time you have to send one packet and get back a reply packet, assuming your entire request fits within one packet, you will have this 9 packet message exchange going on, which is entirely wasteful. So there have been many efforts to try to optimize this overhead. Okay, so what is shown here is what is called client server TCP, which tries to batch these packets. So you can't change. So you could say this is too much of an overhead. I'm not going to use TCP. I'm going to use some other protocol. Okay, you can design your own. But typically that doesn't work because you have communication, both endpoints have to actually talk the same protocol. Okay. So if you want to talk to an arbitrary machine, chances are it will know what TCP is, but it may not know what your protocol is because it's not widely used. So you are stuck with using widely deployed protocols, so you are stuck with the semantics of TCP. Okay. So all you can do is try to optimize it. So here is an optimized view of client server TCP. Okay. All that you do is you take this 9 message exchange, you actually send all the messages. Okay. You cannot avoid sending them because that would mean that you change semantics or TCP, but you batch them to reduce the number of packets that you send. Okay, so the first message that goes essentially says, this is a send, I want to set up a TCP connection. You embed the request in that packet itself, saying here is the request, and you say I'm done in the one packet. So you basically batch 3 packets and you put it into one payload and you send it out. So you have the send, you have the request, you have the fin. Okay. And the server can then process that and then say, here is a send, I want to set up a connection in the other direction. I acknowledge, I've received everything until your fin. That's an acknowledgement, because TCP is actually going to have to send acknowledgements to overcome lost packets and so on. So that's an acknowledgement. The reply is also embedded in there, and so is the fin. Okay, so all 4 have batched, gotten batched and sent, and then once the client receives it, you just send them. Okay, so you reduce the overhead of 9 packet messages to 3. Okay, this was simply a proposal. There's no real implementation that uses it, but people realize that this is wasteful. So for small packet exchanges, here's an optimized view of TCP. Okay. Now, although this particular proposal never took off, it hasn't stopped people from coming up with ways to optimize TCP in specialized scenarios. This only works for client server where there's one request and one reply. If you have longer lived connection where you want to send 3 requests and get 3 replies, this is not true. This is not what you want to pay this full overhead and have multiple request replies coming in before you tear it up. But in the very special case where there are small requests and small replies coming back, that's an optimization. Yeah. So for many such special cases, people are still developing versions of TCP. Okay, the latest proposals are what are called data center TCP. Okay, so TCP between machines of a data center, people are trying to optimize because there is a lot of communication. The same overhead comes and bites you. So you want to optimize it. But they have come up with a optimized version of TCP that only works well in that scenario. But that scenario is becoming very common. So people think it's worthwhile trying to take TCP and optimizing it for scenario A. And so there are papers that you will read in networking conferences now that talk about data center TCP. Many years ago, people tried to optimize client server TCP. And so this kind of, now whether any of that eventually gets deployed is an orthogonal problem. Many times it doesn't. Like this proposal which did not go very far. Okay, people said we'll pay this price. That's okay. Okay. Server will run a little slow, so be it. Okay. Alright, so that's TCP. Now, so that's all the networking we have for the class. We'll talk about RPCs in a moment. But before we go there, there's one more slide on with clients and servers. Okay, so our request response model that we have been talking about is also referred to as a client pull architecture. Okay, in a client pull architecture, the clients initiate the communication and they pull something from the server, whether it's a reply or whether it's a data item, you pull that from the server. Okay. HTTP is inherently a client pull architecture where you send an HTTP request to get a web page, a reply. HTTP or HTML page comes back as part of the HTTP reply. Okay. Most client server architecture that you will see tend to be client pull based. Okay. Client initiates the communication, server sends back the reply. Okay. But there is a certain class of systems where it makes sense for the server to do more than the client. And this class of systems are referred to as the server push architecture. Okay. In the server push architecture, the client may not send explicit requests for data. Okay. Server is asynchronously going to start pushing data to the client. Okay. The client just has to wait and data starts flowing to you over the network. Okay. The most common example of a server push architecture is essentially video and audio streaming. Okay. In most of these systems, what you do is you just hit play. Your client player, you go to hit play, you just send a one-time request saying start playing on this audio or video file. And the server will then just start pushing data to you. Okay. You typically don't have to say, give me the next one frame or the next 1 second of this file and things like that. Okay. You can, there are streaming protocols that do that as well, but there are server push based streaming protocols where you just hit play and you listen on the socket and the server is going to keep pushing data to you and the data just keeps coming. You don't keep on asking, give me the next bit of the file and the next bit of the file. You don't keep sending requests. If you did that, you would be in the client pull architecture. It says, give me the next portion of the file. You just ask the data to be pushed, and the data gets pushed to a video streaming, your stock ticker application that you see that basically keep updating stock codes, and then this rolling thing at the bottom of your screen. That's also push based. Okay, anytime there's an update, it gets pushed to you. Okay. So whenever you have a distributed application, you have to decide, is pull based the better way to design your system or push based? They're fundamentally different. Okay. Most of the systems tend to be pull based, and that's the right thing for many of them. But some are better off doing push over pull. Okay. There are pros and cons of each. Okay. Pull based architectures, the server is stateless. The server doesn't actually have to keep track of what clients are communicating with. The client sends a request, you process the request, send back a reply, you're done with that client. The client wants to have additional communication and send a new request. Okay, that's completely independent typically from the previous request. Okay. Server push architectures tend to be stateful. Okay. Because the client has said play, this may be a 1 hour clip. So for the next 1 hour, you have to keep track of, I have to keep sending data to this client and figure out where the client is and keep sending more and more data. Okay. That is state of the client that the server has kept. Okay. And if there are lots of requests to stream, there is more state the server has to keep track of. Okay. So server push architectures tend to be stateful. Client pull architectures tend to be stateless. Okay. Typically. Okay. Now, if whenever you have stateless architecture, there is less to do from a server standpoint. So your server is going to scale some more. Okay. From a state perspective. Now, from a failure perspective, also it's better because if the server crashes and comes back up, no state is lost. Only some request in the middle that came up and the server was rebooting will time out, and then the server will start functioning again. Okay. But if a server push architecture crashes, then all the files that you are streaming out, all of that memory state is lost. So when you reboot, you don't know who was actually requesting data from you. Yeah, so you are basically not going to be very resilient to failure because if you keep the state in memory, memory state is lost if you crash and reboot or restart the server. Okay, so clients will see a disruption even after the server boot. The client pull architecture, you will see a disruption while the server is restarting. But once that is done, you can start sending requests again and you are done. Okay, so server push architecture is less resilient to failure. Client pull architectures more resilient to failure. Okay. Now there's scalability also from there are two types of scalability. One is how much state do you have to maintain and how much communication overhead do you have. Okay. Clearly, client pull architectures by virtue of being stateless, they don't need any memory state or memory resources to be committed to state. So they are more scalable from a memory perspective. Here you have to have a table. Essentially, it says what clients are currently connected to me, what do I have to do for them, and so on. And if you are memory bound, eventually you will run out of memory resources. Okay. Now, but from a communication standpoint, server push architectures are more efficient. Okay. They're less efficient from a memory standpoint, but more efficient from a communication standpoint. Okay. The reason being, client pull architecture, to get one piece of data, there are two messages exchanged. A request and a reply. In the server push architecture, there is only one message going. So the server is just pushing that data to you. The server knows you need that data because you are playing out this audio or video file. So it's going to push that data to you without the client requesting for it explicitly. Okay. So for every piece of data that goes from the server to the client, there is essentially one message, which is that data itself. In a client pull architecture, you have to first request it. That request has to be processed and then the data is sent. Okay? So there is twice as much communication overhead here than here. Okay? So from a communication standpoint, server push architecture is far more efficient. Okay? But as I said, you have to keep state, that's the downside of it. So there are these pros and cons. Okay? We'll come back to all of this when we talk about caching and so on, because there you'll see scenarios where you can implement an application or a system in either of these two approaches. And then we'll see which one makes more sense, what are some pros and cons in the context of a real application. This is just an abstract discussion at this point. Okay. Any questions on this before I move on to our thesis? So that's RPCs. So we'll come to communication. Okay, so most of the communication we will talk about here is essentially what is called one-to-one communication, where one client sends a request to one server or one server communicates with one client. I also want to mention before I go into RPCs is there's something called group communication. This is referred to as broadcast or multicast, where one message is sent to more than one recipient. Okay, that's what it's called a group. Okay. Simplest example of group communication that you may have used already is send a email message to a mailing list. Group communication. So you address it to a group, that your email message goes to everyone who is subscribed to that group. Okay. Same is true of network messages, although that one is actually email. You can do the same thing in network messages. Endpoints, clients can subscribe to a group, okay, of some sort. And anyone who posts a message to that group, that message will be delivered to all the clients that have subscribed to that group. This is referred to as group communication. It's often useful in scenarios where, let's say, you're doing an audio broadcast or a webcast. Okay, that's an example. You're listening to something that's being delivered on the internet. Lots of people are tuned in. Everyone has subscribed to it. The sender is not actually sending one message to everyone in that group. It actually only sends it one, and some middleware or the system is actually going to be responsible for delivering that message to everyone. The message just could be an audio stream that is going out live, for example. So you may have tuned into, let's say, a sports event on the internet. So that's typically being broadcast. Similar. So those kinds of systems use group communication. And we'll come back to some of this later on. For today, I just want to mention this. This is one-to-many communication, and then just focus for the rest of the class and next class on one-to-one. Okay. Group communication, special case, we'll come back to later. Okay. So let's talk about one-to-one communication. Okay, so I already mentioned this notion of a socket. Okay, so if you want a client and server to talk to one another, you can program this network communication at the lowest level using sockets. You set up a connection, a TCP connection, you write to the socket, you read from a socket, and so on. Okay, that's very low level raw network communication. Okay. If you want to use some higher level abstraction, you can use things like remote procedure calls or remote methods or RMIs and things like that. So that's what we will talk about now. Okay. So what are RPCs? What are remote procedure calls? So the goal of RPCs, let me start with the goal and then we'll see what they do. The goal of RPCs is to make distributed computing look like centralized computing. Okay, so the idea is everyone who's programmed knows how to write centralized single-threaded programs. Okay? You basically take your code. Okay, hopefully you don't write one large main function and put all your code there. You have functions, you have procedures. You take your code, you partition it into procedures. Okay, each function makes a function calls to other function, and that's how you write your code in somewhat modular. And you know how to do that. What if you could use those similar ideas but now write distributed applications? Okay, so this way you can make it much easier for the programmer to write code that is distributed rather than centralized. That was the goal that got these people started down this path of remote procedure. Okay. So the idea of RPCs is very simple. Okay, it basically allows remote services to be called as procedures. So people said rather than sending abstract messages between a client and a server and letting the server process the message and do something to it and send back a reply, why don't we let the client directly call functions on the server? Okay, so rather than saying send me this data item, send a message like that and have the server process that, why not basically call a function saying a read data item at the server, and the server will actually execute that function and send me a reply. Okay. So rather than sending messages, you can directly invoke functions at the server. That would make it much easier because you already know how to invoke functions within your program. It just so happens that this is a special function, it just resides on another machine in another process. Okay. So if you did this, you have what are called remote procedures. So what happens when you write a system using RPCs is clients and servers essentially communicate with one another by just calling functions. Some functions are local, they are local to your program. Some functions are remote. The code for that function resides in another process. You basically just invoke a function call. It just so happens that that function call resides on a different process, on a different machine, but it works exactly the same way. You just call that function. Something underneath figures out that this code is not local to this program, it's elsewhere. It will send off your request to another machine. Yeah, and invoke. So I think there's a figure here that may make this easier to understand. So here is the client machine, there's a server machine. Okay? Server machine has a function called add. Yeah, so it's basically adding two integers, ing. Now the client process wants to invoke that add function, and it's going to send two parameters ing. It wants those two parameters summed and you want a reply. Okay? Now, as far as the client process is concerned, it is just going to call add ij as if it's a local function. Okay? Now, essentially what this function call is going to do is since that code for this function resides there, not here, you are basically going to actually internally send a request to the class server saying invoke this function with these two parameters and send me the reply. Okay? And so that is what's being done here. There is some piece of the client called a client stub that is going to do this for you. Okay? Meaning you don't write code for it. You simply say add ij. The RPC runtime system will generate additional code that will say this method is remote. Okay? So I need to send a message to the server. So it's going to construct a message saying invoke this procedure and here are two parameters for it. Here is the value of the first parameter, here is the value of the second parameter. You take this message, you send it over the network. So here's the packet that goes here. It comes to the server. Okay? Server basically says, what do I need to do? Okay, I have received a request to invoke this method add. And here are the two parameters. Okay, so it's actually going to invoke that function. Yeah, and the two values of ing, and then you construct a reply. Reply is basically sent as a message back, and then you may get that as a return argument or a return value of the add function. Okay. That's the full picture. Now, as far as the programmer is concerned, you will basically, when you implement a server function, you just write the code for add. When you want to invoke the add function, you just invoke it by calling add, as if you are calling a local function. All of this code of constructing the message and sending that message and invoking that is automatically generated for you by the RPC runtime system. So the programmer don't have to worry about it. Okay? You don't even need to worry about actually setting up a TCP connection, socket. All of that is done for you by the RPC runtime system. Okay? So you write less code. If you had to do the same thing with raw sockets, what you would do is you would write code to first, you would write that add method here the same way. But the client would first, you would write code to connect to the server. Just set up a TCP connection, set up a TCP socket. You would construct a message, okay, saying, I want to add, or invoke add, and here are two parameters. You would send that message, you would parse that string at the other end. You would say, I have received a request to add two integers. And you will say, I will call that function, I will add it, and I will construct a message, I'll send it back on the socket. So you write all that code. In this case, you write none of that code. Okay, the RPC runtime system takes care of it for you. So you essentially write the server as a collection of methods, and the clients as a collection of code that invokes those methods, and you're done. Okay? Is that clear? So the idea was basically when these messages come in, they execute some code at the server. So rather than constructing a raw message and executing the code, let the client directly call functions at the server, or vice versa. And that will make communication easier. So this is what a RPC system does. Okay, any questions on this before we move on to some more details of what's actually happening inside? Yes.
Could you think just calling some API on, for example, if you're implementing with Facebook, just calling their API and getting data from them? Is this the same thing you want to do?
So there is, so question is this calling an API where you're basically requesting a method and so on? Okay, so APIs are essentially a way to invoke a method at the other end. Okay, now typically, if you are going to be implementing the API as RPCs, you can do RPCs on the internet as well. Okay. If you are basically letting the system deal with setting up the connection and call the method, then you are basically an RPC system. you are communicating. You can also have APIs that expose things, but you have to first connect to the server and all of that extra code. Then you are not dealing with it at that abstraction. The question is, what level at which are you writing code? Is the library or the runtime system dealing with all the underlying overheads of communication, and you are simply invoking methods? Okay? If maybe those methods are API that the server is exposing, then you are essentially using some form of RPC. You're invoking remote methods or procedures at the end. If you have to do a lot of the low level details, then you are not programming at that level. Okay? So this idea was developed, I think, in the 80s. Okay? There is a technical report here by the fellow who actually came up with this idea of remote procedure calls, and then eventually it came into sort of commercial systems, and now it's widely used. Okay? So this is the way you do RPCs at client server level. Now, of course, if you have more complicated systems, you would do the same thing. That was what was mentioned, but you will expose your methods as interfaces, and other systems can call those interfaces. Those are also examples of this. Yes.
The execution and the data are both at the server level.
Execution is at the server level. Is that the question?
Yeah.
Yes. So the method comes in. You basically call that method. You execute it at the server and send back.
And the data is also at the server level.
The data.
If there is any.
Yes. So the data, if this method has state, you may assign the request saying what is my current balance, or whatever, some message. So there is this notion of state at the server. So all the data is at the server. You look up that data item and send back a reply. Okay. Right. So this is remote RPCs or remote procedure calls, and this is another picture of what's happening. Client is executing. Client makes a function call. Okay, that function call in this case is the remote procedure invocation. It triggers a message transparently to you. You don't write code for that. Okay, the message is the procedure is executed at the server side. A reply is sent back, and while the reply is actually being generated, the client is essentially waiting. Okay. Just as when you call a local function, you have to wait until the reply comes back. Okay, there's a return from the function. Same thing is true here. So the semantics of calling a remote procedure are no different than the semantics of calling a local procedure. Okay. So that is the paper that was referred to by this guy Nelson. This is the same technical report here. In 1984 is when they came up with this idea. Okay. Just skip this. Let me say a few things. Okay, so now there are some caveats when you call local remote procedures. Okay, that you would not have to worry about when you call local procedure. So for instance, when you call a remote procedure, typically you will not pass parameters by reference. So you have to pass them by value. You can't pass a pointer to a server. Okay? When the server tries to dereference that pointer, that's meaningless. That pointer is only meaningful for the client because the address in the client's address space. So that point, so you can't do things like that. Okay? So you have to put some restrictions. Although it looks exactly the same as calling a local function, there are some restrictions on what you do with the parameters. Okay? Passing pointers doesn't work. Pointers don't mean anything to the server. Okay? Same thing. You have to pass everything by value. I presume you know what pass by value and pass by reference is. When you do pass by value, you take a value of, create a copy of all of the parameters, and you send a copy of it. When you do pass by reference, you only pass a reference, so you don't actually pass the actual value. Okay, since everything has to be accessible to the server, all the parameters that you are passing, you have to create a copy of each parameter, send it in a network message, and send it over. Okay, so parameter passing is here. You can do call by value, call by reference. Typically, you only can do call by value when you do remote procedure calls. That's the first thing you have to deal with. Okay? The second thing you need to know is the same thing is global variables you cannot have. So you cannot you cannot write a function on the server side where you are referring to a global variable that resides on the client. Okay? So you can't do things like that because of different address spaces. So some things that you have to keep in mind when you do RPCs. Okay? But there are other things that the system is going to do for you that makes your job as programmers much easier. Okay? The system generates what are called stubs. Okay? These are essentially proxies at both ends. Okay? So what was shown in the picture here. So the stubs are code that the system generates for you that you link with your application that essentially deals with setting up a connection to the server. It deals with constructing a message whenever you call a remote procedure, sending that message, waiting for the reply. All of that is done for you by the stuff. So you don't have to deal with all that. You just call function and something else deals with all the networking part for you. So a lot more code generated automatically for you. You don't have to worry about it. Okay? The same is true of what is called marshalling and demarshalling of argument. Okay, so here I showed a procedure that is basically sending in a simple integer value. But parameters could be arbitrary. You could send structures, you could send arrays, you could send whatever you want as parameter, just as you could call local function. And the system has to create a copy of all of this, stick it into a message, read, construct that structure at the other end, okay, and then basically hand it to the server machine. Okay, all of this is referred to as what is called flattening and or marshalling of argument. Okay, so let's assume you have a two-dimensional array. Okay, array A is two-dimensional array and it has values in it. Okay, if you basically call a remote procedure foo and has passed this array, you can't pass a pointer to the array. That just doesn't work. So the array resides on the client side. So you have to take this entire array and put it in the message and send it over. Okay. Now the question is, the client and the server have to agree on how you are going to pack and unpack arbitrary data structures like arrays or structure. Okay. So maybe you have to basically construct a message out of this array. So maybe you take the entries in row order. So you will form a message saying this is item 00, this is A01, so on. So you construct a linear sequence of bytes using a two-dimensional structure and you stick it into a message. And at the other end, you have to agree that you are basically getting your array in row order. And then unpack it and reconstruct. If you try to unpack it in column order, the array will not look like the same it was on the client. Okay. So all of these rules of how do you pack each data structure, how do you unpack it, have to be agreed. For integers, this is trivial. It's in a single element, but when you have more complicated data structures that you are passing by value, you have to worry about all of these things. Okay. Now, that is one thing. The other thing that you do when you do marshalling and unmarshalling is that there is no implicit assumptions in RPCs that the client and servers are homogeneous. Okay. They are designed, the system is designed to be heterogeneous. Okay. You can have a Linux machine making an RPC request to Windows machine, or a Spark machine. Even the hardware architectures don't have to be the same. Okay. So some architectures may be little Indian, other architectures may be big Indian. Okay. I talked about little Indian, big Indian last time, where which is the leftmost bit, the most significant or least significant. You think of an integer that just arrived over the network, okay, from the client. If you interpret it the wrong way, the whole integer is going to get flipped. You'll get the wrong value out of it. So the client may be little Indian, the server may be big Indian. If you always say read left to right, and you are a big Indian on the other end because you are heterogeneous, you are going to get everything incorrectly. Okay. So to avoid this problem, because the client, when you write the client, you don't even have to know what the server is going to be, whether it's going to run on a Spark. You just designed it to interoperate. Okay. So the way this is dealt with is this stub code is going to convert whatever native format you have into a universally agreed format. This is called external data representation. So you will declare, for instance, that in this RPC system, when you send out a message, everything is sent out in big Indian order. Okay? So if your native is little Indian, you have to basically construct it in big Indian and send it. If you are big Indian, you just send it as. So you pre-agreed that everything comes in big Indian order. So at each local end, you might have to do translation, but you know what order things are coming over the network. Okay? That way you don't have to worry about all the client the same as me or the opposite. Okay? You know, regardless of what it is, when it sends everything to me, it's translated it into this agreed format. It's called XDR, external data representation format, and you send it over. Okay. So all of this translation all has to be dealt with at the client. If you are writing all this code yourself and you have to interpret, you would have to do this as a programmer. The system is not designed to do all that automatically. If you say, I need to make this work, whether the other end is running on Windows, Solaris, Linux, whatever it might be, then you have to figure out how do you deal with all the native format, translation and all of that. Maybe that server is 64-bit, here you are 32-bit. If you send a 32-bit integer at the other end, the native may be 64 bit. You have to deal with all these problems. Okay. Luckily, this code will do all that, so you don't need to worry about it. Okay. So there's a fair bit of things that are happening underneath the covers, which programmers don't need to worry about. Okay. So when I'll show you an example of RPC in just a moment. You essentially, the way it works is client makes a procedure call, the server is written as a standard procedure. The procedure call at the client comes to the client stub. The client stub is going to package the argument, set up the connection, send out the message, all of that. Okay, so the part where you package it is called marshalling. Okay, and we are going to basically generate all of that code, okay, to do that. And at the server end, you will basically do the opposite. Okay, you will basically, once you send the message, you unpack it, you do the work, return the result to the stub will construct the message and send things back to you. So I will show you a picture of, okay, so here's a picture of this one. So here is a client application, there is a server application. Essentially, to construct an RPC, you say these methods of the server are exposed. That's the interface of the API that the server is exposing. Not every function that the server has written has to be exposed to the client. Only some methods can be declared as remote procedures, not every method. Okay, so when you write the server, you declare these methods are exposed to the outside client. Okay, that's specified in an interface file. That's the server code. This is the client code. Okay. So what you will do is you will basically run this code through a special compiler. Okay, this is an RPC compiler. So RPC compiler is essentially going to take that spec of the interface and it will generate all the stubs for you. So all that code will be auto-generated. And then you take this code and then you link it to the client. That's the client stub code. You take that C file and use this written in C for instance. Take that C file and this client code and you will compile it to the client binary and you will do the same thing for the server. Okay. So you will write V files and there will be all these additional files that are automatically generated. Here is the XDR file. That's the file that is going to convert everything to an XDR representation and send it out and so on. Okay. So I'm going to show a very quick example here. It's a detailed example later in the course. It's not later, it's now. Okay, so here is this add client and add server that I was showing you. Okay, so that's the server code. Okay, that's basically just an add function that's going to receive some two arguments and is going to add them here, A plus B, and reply. I will show you also the interface file. Okay, so this is your interface here. Okay, you will say that here is the add method that the server is exposing. You give it a version number so your APIs can have versions and whatnot. And you say that what comes in is a pair of integers, that's a struct here. The struct has A and B as two arguments. Okay. This is the interface. So this is what you declare is the method that the server is exposing. Okay. That's the server code there. All that you've written is those 4 lines of code. Okay. So to add A and B, you have not written any networking code as you can see at the moment here. Okay. And here is the client code. So basically, that's a main function, we'll ignore that for the moment. Here is where you call the server. So you're basically calling add underscore 1, which is the version 1 of the add method, and you basically just call the send two arguments in the struct A and B, and that's you wait for the result. So this is basically the remote procedure invocation, RPC invocation. Okay. You have to do a one-time setup, which is I need to create the client and find the server, and then something else is going to actually create the socket and whatnot. Okay, so you say find the server, okay, send this RPC request to the server. This is all you have written. Okay. So nothing has to be done as far as socket. That is just code to read values of A and B from the command line. So you can ignore that. That's how you're feeding in the two values you need to add. Okay. This is all you write. So then you will run this thing through this interface definition through a compiler, okay, which I'll show you. Okay, so I have a make file, so I'm going to do the whole thing, but I'll show you the make file before I do anything. Okay, so this is where you will call that RPC compiler, RPC gen. You just call that and you say add.x and it will generate a whole bunch of files for you. Once you do that, you will take the stub code. Scrolled off. Okay. So here is where you take your code and take all the auto-generated files. You just link them and you will construct a binary. You will compile each code and you generate the binary. And that same thing is done for the server. This is your code, server code that you wrote. These are the two stub files that were generated for you. Yeah, so let me just show you. You just run make, it will go through some errors which we can ignore. Okay. So you will see first thing it did was it called that RPC gen file. Okay. You can ignore the rest for now. Okay. So you'll see that a whole set of new files have been created. That's a header file, that's what was generated. Okay. That's stub code for the server. Yes, we see there's a stub code for the client. That's the XDR file there. So you can see what is in there. Yeah, this is actually simple C code but generated automatically. Okay, so this one just essentially calls a macro, so you can't actually see all of the fancy things. So you call this client call macro, which is going to do all of the setting up the connection and all of that for you. So here is some more stuff. So here is the server side. So here you can see that there is a automatically generated function to close down a connection or close down. Okay. Here is basically the stub code for the add program. Okay. Here is where you will receive the message, okay, and then you are going to basically call the method and send back a reply. Okay. So that's all code is automatically generated. Just like get the arguments and you call the result, you call the function and then you add it and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is happening at the server. This is the server stub. The main program for the server stub automatically generated main program for the server and so on. Okay, so all of this code will be generated. And then there is add XDR, which again I think is just simple stub code. So there's not much to be done here. So you're just going to do a local translation. XDR translation, saying this is an integer, so convert it from whatever format it came to my native format. And these are library calls you make to the RPC library. Okay. So you don't really have to look at the stub code at all. I'm just showing you what is inside. All you need to do is write that interface file, run it through this RPC compiler, it will generate that code, you just link it, and you're done. You will construct a binary and all of that you don't have to really worry about. You know, if you want to see what is happening underneath, you can go and look at all this. Okay. So I'm just going to show. Okay, so coming back to this picture, so that's essentially what happened. So I took that interface file, I ran it through RPC and it generated those files. Okay. Then you take the XDR client file and you take your code, which was very short, and you construct a binary. That's what I commented, and you do the same thing for the server stuff and the server code. Okay. So this is just to illustrate how RPCs work. You know, let me talk a little bit about what happens when you actually run the system. I talked about the stuff part, but there are a few other things you have to do. Okay, so first is when the client and the server start up and the client invokes a message at the server, you have to find the server. Okay, because when you wrote the code, you didn't write any code about where the server is. None of that was specified. Okay? Server may be listening on some port, you don't know where it's listening. Okay? Now, typically, as I had mentioned, you have to, if you have to do this, you have to write a directory service. You can hard code the server name, but or you can register yourself with the directory service. In the RPC world, this is referred to as a port mapper. The server starts up, it registers itself with the port mapper, saying, I am the server, this is the API I expose, and this is the port I am listening on. So when the client starts up, it has to first ask this port mapper saying, is there a server that is exporting add program version 1? So that's the interface I need to work with. And then the port mapper will say, I know a server that is exporting add program version 1 because that's what is the interface, and it's listening at this port. And then you'll get the port number, at which point, so this is also done one time, and then once you know where the server is and what port it's listening on, then you can set up. The stub code actually knows who to talk to or how to set up TCP connections and so on and so forth. Okay, so this part also you have to deal with. Part of it is dealt with for you, and some of it you have to just worry about registering. Not worry, the server will register itself with the port mapper. So if you actually look at the code, I can put up the sample code if you want. You can actually compile it and see what's happening. You'll see that there is a client create call in there and so on. And these are all RPC calls. Typically you don't write this call, this is generated for you. But those are the ones inside that are actually doing these things for you. Okay? The goal here is not to write RPC programs, it's to know how RPC systems work. So it's good for you to understand a little bit about what is happening in the machine.
How does the client know what the server machine is?
Okay. So typically, question is how does the client know what server machine it is in the first place? Okay. In RPC systems, you make an assumption that the client machine, the IP address of the server might be known, but the port number may not be known. Okay. So it's on a well-known machine, but the port number is found through the port mapper. That's why it's called a port mapper. It tells you what ports are mapped to what servers that are running on the system. Okay, so if you actually look at the code I showed you, you will see that you actually invoke it with. So you see the invocation there. It's a server host, and you provide number 1, number 2 as arguments here, right there. Right? So you specify the name of the host, but you don't specify the port number. That is automatically gotten by this client create. Is going to look up the port mapper and say where is that server that I need that provides that program. Okay, so port is not specified, but the machine name is specified.
Just a follow-up question, could you build this architecture over HTTP so you only need to know where the server machine is or what port you are. You can just use port 80 and you can get the server IP using DNS.
So question is, can you build RPC systems over HTTP? Yeah, so there are systems that are RPC, many RPC systems that are built over HTTP. Yeah, typically these days, because HTTP is well-known protocol, rather than sending a request and a reply, you can actually send RPC messages and get RPC replies. So there's something called XML RPC. Okay. That's essentially doing RPCs using XML that runs over HTTP. Okay, port 80. You still need to know the machine name. Right? So port number is automatic in that case. It's port 80.
But DNS would sort of provide that to you.
Yes, but you need to know the machine name, right? You need to, not the IP address, but at least the machine name needs to be specified. Yeah, so you can do that, then the port number is not necessary. But this is designed for arbitrary applications. So there are many servers that are sitting on every Unix machine, and the NFS server, the print server, they all can listen on RPCs. So for those kinds of applications, this works. So building web-based applications, you're better off going with the HTTP RPC system, not like a native C-built RPC system. Okay? So this is just a flavor of how RPCs were originally designed with C. Okay? These days RPC systems run over lots of different things, including HTTP, as you pointed out. Okay, so we are going to stop here. We ran out of time. We'll continue this discussion next time, and then also talk about remote methods, which is RPC systems in the Java world or in the object-oriented world. Okay, and see where to go from there.